For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that China accounted for two-thirds of the world's oil consumption in the last decade? And did you know that every fifth car in the world in 2030 will be an electric vehicle? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host, Anil Padmanabh. 50 years ago, the world experienced an energy shock when oil-producing countries declared an embargo. The resulting shock waves caused severe structural damage to most economies, including that of India. However, there was an upside. It spurred the research in alternate energy options. At that time, it was nuclear power. There's some coincidence that 5 decades later, the world is experiencing another shock. This time, it is far more complicated. At one level, your worsening climate change, which is visible around us, these extreme weather experiences that we are all witnessing. At another, the ongoing geopolitical reset is muddying the waters for the world to generate a collective response to tackle climate change. This inclement backdrop is what COP28 is looking at. It convenes in Dubai in a fortnight from now. What does one make of all of this? Is it that the world has lost its battle against climate change and that it is on the road to perdition? There is a nice document released by the International Energy Agency called the World Energy Outlook. It's an annual offering of theirs. This year's issue provides excellent context to unpack all these questions that we have in our mind. So I spoke to the co-author, Siddharth Singh. He's also a Paris-based energy analyst for IEA. I began by asking Siddharth about this unfortunate coincidence of the global energy shock. The big thought in my mind was whether history was repeating itself once again after 50 years.
The history itself indeed has repeated itself, but there are some changes compared to what the world was like back then. So firstly, as you correctly identified, this time there's an added dimension of a climate crisis. And of course, back then, the world was far more reliant on oil as a share of its total energy demand compared to today. The share is reduced, although it has been taken over by other forms of energy, which are also undergoing its own kinds of crisis. For example, natural gas use has grown, and that has led also to increased reliance among some countries, and they are now facing some consequences of a natural gas-related shock as well. So the world has changed, but we now have a wider suite of options, more technologies, and the growth of clean energy technologies in the past few years has helped us mitigate some parts of the crisis. And I think one major change compared to maybe 50 years ago, I mean, for the benefit of your viewers, 50 years ago when the crisis happened, that led to the creation of the International Energy Agency, where we work right now. And the difference between then and now is that now we have the International Energy Agency, unlike back then, and we are working at the forefront with governments, with other stakeholders to mitigate aspects of the crisis. So I think these are the kind of changes that really differentiate that crisis from this, although indeed you're right, history does repeat itself.
So that this fact that you have flagged even climate change as an additional factor, doesn't that skew the risks even further, in the sense that they are amplifying the existing plus new risks?
Absolutely. So climate change is an added vector. It does complicate issues because on the one side, you want to ensure adequate energy of all kinds for people as they need it. On the other side, there are sustainability concerns that compel us to push towards cleaner options that don't lead, global warming over time. Additionally, climate change in itself is a threat and a risk to energy infrastructure. So we need to create more resilient systems. And also, we are still trying to provide energy access. There are still hundreds of millions of people around the world who don't have access to clean energy. Forget clean energy or to any energy for that matter. And the reliance on traditional biomass for cooking um, is still very high, especially in Africa and parts of Asia. And the lack of electricity is also an added concern. So these are the kind of issues that are compounded by the presence of extreme weather events that itself emanate from climate change. So indeed, I think we have our task cut out in that sense.
So, this grim backdrop that the world is facing has given the kind of segue into the COP28 meeting coming up in Dubai in another fortnight or so. So the IEA outlook, the latest outlook, precedes these meetings, of course.
Yeah.
But they make a very interesting revelation. It's a mix of good news plus, the fact that they make this observation that fossil fuel consumption is about to peak and will start actually dropping from 2030 onwards.
Indeed, I think this is a major, finding from our analysis. Just to say that we analyze the world, using the best data that's available anywhere. And the idea here is to understand the implication of our choices today. So we have certain policies in place. We have a certain set of market conditions in place. We analyze the impact of these changes on the future. And we see that, for the first time ever, the demand for each of the fossil fuels individually, so coal, oil, and natural gas, does indeed peak within this decade and starts to decline after that. Although in the case of oil and natural gas, it's more of a plateau than a sharp decline under the current policy scenarios. So this has significant, implications to the global energy economy and to the economy in general. And just to say that this peak in fossil fuel demand of each of the fossil fuels is actually being driven to a significant extent by the uptake of clean energy technology. So just as a small example, the share of solar and wind in electricity generation was only about 2 or 3% a decade ago. It has now increased to 13%, which is quite significant in terms of its rise, and it's expected to keep growing even more fast in several economies around the world. And secondly, electric vehicles, which were 1 in 5 cars sold only 5 years ago were electric, and now it's increased to 1 in 20. It went from 1 in 25 to 1 in 5 in this short period of time. So you can see the kind of momentum of clean energy technologies, and that is somehow chipping away on the demand for fossil fuels. Of course, there's a structural reason, which is China. China does constitute a major share of global energy demand growth, and therefore any structural issues in China has an implication on overarching energy demand.
So, just staying on the China point that you made, now this is actually going to reflect in decrease in fossil fuel consumption, because China was one of the biggest consumers of it is a fact, single largest consumer of energy the last decade particularly. So their exit was for various reasons. One, there's a slowdown of the economy, and B, their own greening is gaining momentum. So, but that if you exclude the greening part, it's not a very healthy way of improving the overall climate outlook for the world, right? I mean, ideally, you should all go down the green path.
Yes, but we have to understand a simple fact that energy demand growth happens when economies grow. And naturally, when economies stop growing, then it will have an implication on energy as well. You're absolutely right that China's growth has somehow evolved, and it's not to say that China will stop growing. I think we have to understand the structural changes that are happening within the country itself. So the working age population in China already peaked and is expected to keep falling as their fertility rate, of course, has been quite low, much lower than replacement levels for quite some time now. In addition to that, a lot of the construction-led growth that happened, we are seeing changes in the pattern now. So China has an overcapacity of several industries such as cement and steel and so on. So we're not expecting more capacity to be added on that front. Similarly, a lot of the buildings stock that exists, they have some world-class infrastructure on that front, and for various structural reasons, we don't expect that kind of growth that we saw over the last 30 years to be repeated again. In some ways, there's been a saturation in some of these aspects of the economy, and for these reasons, of course, China. You have to understand the role that China's played in global energy demand growth. 50%, like half, nearly half of the energy demand growth over the last 30 years has come from one country alone. Right. So naturally, when things change in China.
So but that deficit probably will be bridged very soon as global South, which includes Africa, India, and the other parts of South Asia, start playing catch up. So, what is the IEA sense on this pattern of growth? Will these countries, continents in the case of Africa, leapfrog to sustainable growth rather than going through the traditional means, or will it be a hybrid that you need both options? Particularly because of what you said earlier, that energy access is one big challenge in many of these countries.
No, absolutely. I mean, firstly, just to understand where this growth is coming from outside of China in emerging economies. So Southeast Asia being a major center for growth, India being a major center right now, Latin America, of course, and I mean in general, Africa is expected to have much higher growth rates in the future. But the issue is that all of them put together at the moment still don't have the kind of momentum that China had over the last 30 years. I think we have to understand that China's growth in the last 30 years was truly exceptional. So even though all these other countries today are definitely on a higher growth rate trajectory, they don't fully compensate for what we saw in the case of China. China's was historically, at least in modern history, it was unprecedented. And for sure, in the case of India, for example, we see that now in the next 30 years, India is the center for the largest demand for energy growth in the world, more than any other continent or region. But even that, falls well short of what China accomplished over the last 30 years. And for those reasons, the outlook is a little mixed on that front. But having said that, I think you made a very important point that the countries that are yet to grow, that are on the path to increasing energy demand, they have the options today of adopting more and more clean energy options. These options did not exist when China first started its growth. Cheap solar did not exist back then. Cheap electric mobilities and cheap batteries did not exist 30 or 40 years ago, but they do now. And in many countries, we are already seeing a rapid uptake. Only recently, there was an African country that had very high diesel subsidies. They stopped the subsidies, and very quickly the outlook for solar changed very significantly, because solar panels and solar based electricity generation is now the cheapest form of electricity generation in most countries of the world. And I think that will naturally lead to a faster uptake of clean energy options.
So, Siddharth, logically, what you just said, the impact, the spread of a green economy will actually reflect more in the global South purely because they're playing catch up and they have the options that you laid out before us of cheap tech, etc., than in the developed countries which have to rely more on mitigation, etc., right?
Yeah, but having said that, it's also the role of the International Energy Agency to flag where we see perhaps shortcomings, or perhaps areas where we need further improvement. So, let's talk about investments, and you will see where emerging economies kind of, have their task cut out, and plus the world has its task cut out in terms of what we want to see emerging economies, now go through. So, globally this year, um, 1.8 trillion US dollars was spent on clean energy investments. So this is infrastructure, this is grids, this is power generation, and so on. Compared to that, only 1 trillion was spent on fossil fuels. So in other words, clean energy investments are rising very fast. So the ratio used to be 1:1 5 years ago, and now it's 1:1.8 in favor of clean energy. So already you can see the uptake. But of this investments into clean energy, if you exclude China and if you exclude obviously advanced economies, so the rest of the world, we're talking about emerging economies excluding China, that they have received only about 250 billion US dollars in investment, and this has remained flat. This has not increased over the last 4, 5, or 10 years even. And that is a major cause of concern. If you really want to see the rest of the world catch up, and then, as you say, leapfrog, you will need to see tripling of clean energy investments into these countries by the end of this decade, and that's where I guess the global community needs to come together.
So you have addressed the gorilla in the room, which is climate finance. Now, that is something all the rich nations have been dragging their feet for over now 2 decades. So are you hopeful that Dubai might be a turning point in that game of attrition?
So, I mean, I obviously I'm not, qualified to comment on the outcome of the upcoming, big climate summit. But having said that, in general, the world has fallen short on what is needed in developing countries. Uh, there are, of course, some structural reasons why the investments have not kept up, because even in these developing countries, there are structural risks that any investment would face. So there are some things that the governments of emerging markets themselves need to address internally, and that would kind of help unlock further investments from abroad. But yes, there is indeed a need for greater innovation, and just the volumes of finance that is available to these economies needs to increase fast, and be deployed very quickly. Otherwise, we may miss the bus on the 1.5 degrees emission the temperature rise target.
Several things are clear from our conversation with Siddharth. One, as he and the IEA report that he co-authored very clearly says that climate change is for real. It's also visible to us from all the anecdotal experiences of extreme weather that we are experiencing. The energy shock is worsening the circumstances. Second, there's an upside. Today, unlike 50 years ago, the world has access to cheap, clean technology and alternative energy sources. However, all this requires a change in the mindset of the developed world. So far, they've been dragging their feet despite accounting for bulk of the global emissions in generating funds to enable the global south to manage the energy transition that is so required. Maybe the upcoming COP28 is the moment where the developed world will signal a rethink. Fingers crossed. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please to share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'll be back again next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.